Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Nadine Menendez, wife of former Senator Bob Menendez, Democrat, found guilty in federal bribery trial from abcnews.go.com, and that was posted by Color Monochrome. And yeah, I think a lot of progressives would say, see, when our side does it, they hold them accountable, and like when your side does it, but it's one of those things where the Menendezes, they could safely throw them under the bus since they didn't have since they were liabilities rather than assets. That's a lot of politics for you. It's very much a game of social capital. If you're viewed as more of a liability than an asset, they'll throw you under the bus. I think they might do that to Pete Hegseth soon, the Secretary of Defense, because of the Signalgate stuff. But yeah, people will say, we hold ours accountable, but you won't hold yours accountable. But in reality, the only time people are held accountable is when they don't have the social capital anymore to not be held accountable. People will say, what about Donald Trump? Donald Trump, the thing is, he did get 34 counts, regardless of how I personally think that was kind of a politicized prosecution of him. But regardless, he can't be held accountable since he has too much social capital, and people elected him president. So it's just going to show you, people always say, oh, the law is going to be as indiscriminate as possible. Well, in reality, that's never been the case. It's always come down to who has the economic and social capital to get away with what, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have White House assesses ways to persuade woman to have more children from NewYorkTimes.com, posted by Patom13, and that's a cross post from the Woman in News subreddit. And yeah, I don't think that's as bad as a lot of stuff I've heard about Trump and his administration. But of course, Reddit these days, they'll think anything that Trump does is Nazism, even giving people money for having babies like they do in some other countries. And yeah, ultimately, I don't think the government should be involved in people's sex lives at all, even if it might be for a well-intentioned positive reason. But yeah, ultimately that they are the ones with the monopoly on the use of force, as I always say, so they can decide and enforce whatever laws they want to. I personally do think people should be having more kids if they want to, and if they don't want to have kids, they shouldn't have to either. But I do think increasingly the U.S. is having a population decline. So I do think if the government does want to reward people for having kids, I do think they should be able to, and I think they do that in some other countries like Japan, where if the U.S. is having a population decline, Japan's having a real population decline by comparison. So yeah, ultimately, the government can give people whatever money it wants for whatever reason, and yeah, I personally don't really care for some things they give you money for, but they can give you money for whatever you want to, for whatever people will justify what they justify, and that's pretty much true regardless of what form of government is in power currently. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump just attacked the Constitution and violated his oath of office from usnews.com, posted by Dr. Who 07, and that's a cross post from the Law subreddit. And yeah, of course, Reddit. So Reddit was actually the actual headline is Trump says U.S. cannot give every person it wants to deport a trial, but that's the actual headline of the article linked in from U.S. News. But of course, Reddit, it's always gonna be like Orange Man bad. Here's another way Orange Man bad. I'm pretty sure this exact headline has been shared around Reddit at least probably like hundreds or thousands of times by now. And it just goes to show you how, I personally think, everyone should be entitled to due process. But, the government, they're the one with the monopoly on the use of force. So they can, if they want to exempt you from due process, and there's nothing you can do about it. And I love how these people are saying, oh, we love the Constitution, even though, a lot of times during Biden's tenure, they said, oh, the Constitution's getting in the way of our agenda. And it's the same thing with the Supreme Court. They love the Supreme Court now, especially since it ruled 9-0 against Trump when it comes to the deportations. But, during Biden's tenure, it was just a way to it was just another thing in the way of the progressive agenda. These people have no principles other than in-group good, out-group bad, and this is just another example of that. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have how to protect yourself from phone searches at the U.S. border from Wired.com, posted by FlimsyAl5563. And yeah, ultimately, if I didn't have to go near the border right now, I definitely wouldn't. That's my thoughts on there. But if you want to go across the border, go near the border, that you justify doing whatever you want to. But my thoughts there are, if you want to take your phone, take your phone. But just be aware there are tons of border agents around. Maybe if you want to read this article and maybe they'll have some good other tips. But I personally just think the libertarian solution is don't go near the border right now, especially with how kind of militarized it's being. And I personally, as a libertarian, I don't really care for the concept of the border. But ultimately, if the people want to militarize any area, especially a government, since they have the legal monopoly of the use of force, that sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. So that's why I personally wouldn't go to the border right now. Then we have RFK Jr. set to launch disease registry tracking autistic people from NewRepublic.com, posted by Donald Key. And I'm as an autistic person, I was diagnosed at the age of 3. I personally don't really care for being added to a registry, but at this point, there's tons of government registries, and you have since its founding, really the U.S. has had a census every 10 years. That's a government registry, and Social Security is about to turn 90 in August. There's another one, and you have stuff like the sex offender registry, which are well intentioned, but it definitely can be subject to abuse, as with everything the government has. And ultimately, I don't think any government databases or registries are that libertarian, but ultimately, the government's going to justify what it justifies. And, as a libertarian, I definitely kind of like being put on another government registry. If you're not on at least 5 government registries, or if you're not on at least 5 government registries, are you even a real libertarian? That's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have 60 Minutes executive producer Bill Owens resigns, saying he lost his ability to make independent decisions about the show, from Deadline.com, and that's from posted by Donald Key. That's a cross post from the television subreddit. And I don't really care for 60 Minutes or CBS as a whole. They're just kind of mainstream media propaganda, or legacy media, or alpha media, as I like to sometimes call them. But I do think he should have been able to make whatever decisions he wants about the show. But ultimately, if he wants to resign because of Trump and his lawsuits against the 60 Minutes, I guess I could just see that. Personally, I don't think Trump should be suing the media. I definitely do think they're biased against him, and they definitely should be probably held accountable for their bias. But the way to hold them accountable isn't suing them or hanging up in the court of law. It's just let them become irrelevant. And that's what I definitely see happening to pretty much all the traditional news sources. Even cable news, which is doing pretty well by the standards of cable these days, is becoming increasingly irrelevant. I think Tucker Carlson was the last super relevant person that was on cable news, and he got kicked out of Fox News, I think, in 2023. So it just goes to show you, social media is the future. Traditional legacy alphabet media is the past, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump says CBS should lose license after 60-minute segments on Ukraine, Greenland from thehill.com, posted by CH4Locks, and that's cross-post from the Moderate Politics subreddit. And I personally don't really care for... I think the problem is that, stations like CBS even need a license in the first place. I think all licenses are kind of anti-libertarian. You shouldn't have to ask the government permission to do anything. But as I said in my previous post, Trump needs to stop putting up such a fight against the media when it comes to using legal tactics against them, because it's only going to make him look bad and look like he's going after the free press, even though the corporate press is very much different than the free press these days. I would say the corporate press is funded by billionaires, and Reddit hates billionaires unless they're like a George Soros, Pierre Omidyar, J.B. Pritzker type who toe the DNC line and always support their agenda. But regardless, I think the libertarian solution is as I said previously, let these guys become irrelevant. No one cares about them anymore. And they're free to say whatever bullshit they want. I don't personally care for stuff like slander or libel, but free speech does include those. And yeah, just let them become irrelevant. Hopefully the clock's almost up on 60 minutes. We're almost at the hour mark, I guess you could say, in that regard. But yeah, I personally don't think going after them is the libertarian solution. You just gotta let them fail on their own merits, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have AG Pam Bondi holds first meeting of anti-Christian bias task force from Round News, posted by Doctor Who 07. And yeah, ultimately, I don't want the government getting involved in religion at all. I would say, separation of church and state. I do think, people that there is anti-Christian bias in this country. I'm not going to deny that. Reddit, of course, would say, no, there's not anti-Christian bias. There's anti-atheism bias because everyone wants to think they're the most oppressed person in the country. But regardless, I think that anti-Christian bias is something for Christians like me and other Christians to deal with and find solutions for, not that of the government. It's the same thing when it comes to bias of any kind. A lot of Obama and Biden had, I think like anti-racist task force, I think, and that's not very libertarian either. If they want to have if private individuals want to have anti-racist or anti-Christian or anti-religious or anti-anything task force, I think they should be able to. But I think government task force, I don't think we should be wasting government resources on discrimination. People are going to justify discrimination against whoever they feel like, and that can be mean. But they can justify whatever they feel like, and the answer isn't let's get government involved. The libertarian solution, as always, is let's get government out of it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.